Hi everyone, Jonathan Sriranganathan here, back with another Reimagining the City discussion. I'd like to start by acknowledging the rightful owners of the land we're chatting on, the Yuggera and Turrbal peoples, recognising that sovereignty was never ceded and that the struggle for land back and racial justice really needs to be at the centre of all our political movements and discussions. So I'm joined here today by Anna Carlson, my partner and friend and long-time political interlocutor. Anna has had a huge impact on my political thinking for a long time, and we've thought together about, I guess, how change happens and how political systems shape us and how we can shape them. And obviously this Reimagining the City discussion series is a little bit about the Greens' vision for the future of so-called Brisbane, but it's also about unpacking the mechanics and the messy insides of election campaigning itself. So today we wanted to think a little bit more about, how different systems discipline us and how we're co-opted by the mainstream political systems when we try to participate in them. But I guess, also thinking more deeply about how change happens and all that sort of maybe slightly deeper stuff that we don't always make enough time for in political conversations. So, Anna, did you want to introduce yourself and maybe tell us a little bit about why you think it's important to be having these kinds of discussions?
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here and want to echo that acknowledgement of the place we are. I am a white settler in this place, so a lot of my thinking on the stuff we're going to talk about today is also shaped by reckoning with what it means to be complicit in regimes of ongoing colonisation and working to think more seriously about what just futures look like. So, as you mentioned, my name's Anna, and I've recently finished my PhD in political science. I'm also a radio producer. I'm currently working for AAA Murray Country over in West End. I feel very grateful to be in a radio production role over there, working with some absolutely incredible people to bring First Nations political education to life. So I think
you also run a reading group.
I do. I also am one of many organisers of the Brisbane Free University, which is a kind of political education collective.
And you also run Radio Reversal, another show on
Indeed.
Yeah.
Another collective project that I'm very grateful to be part of, which has both Brisbane Free University and Radio Reversal have been long-term projects in my life, which is something we might dig into a bit later if we have time, around the kinds of things that you can only learn from doing things over and over again. But I guess to come back to that kind of central question of like why these conversations, this is something that we've been talking about a lot because it's something that I really wanted to kind of come to grips with, like why me on this podcast. And I think the way I've been thinking about it is around this idea of what it means to kind of challenge common sense ideas, wherever we find them, to kind of do this deeper work of critical thinking, of political education, which is to say, instead of just accepting things as they are, to think a little bit more deeply about how they came to be that way, and whether or not these ideas of certain things just being how it is, whether that's actually enough, know?
Because even, within the Greens, we talk a lot about changing political systems and thinking outside the box and all that sort of stuff. But there are still certain orthodoxies of, this is how you run an election campaign and this is how political candidates are supposed to behave. And obviously, like my mayoral campaign is trying to push back against that a little bit. But it seems like whatever systems we participate in, whatever institutions we go into, like you've spent a bit of time in the world of media and the world of academia and like whatever space it is, there are certain norms and standards of how people are expected to behave, and those systems do shape us over time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is one of the things that we wanted to dig into, right, was the ways that we can think together and think across the different experiences that we have of different kinds of institutions, all of which are implicated in continuing colonisation, whether they're universities or electoral systems. They're part of an infrastructure that has its roots in continuing unlawful occupation of this land. So these are all institutions that are problematic in the most fundamental sense, right? They're all in some way implicated in regimes of continuing violence. And so thinking then about how we strategically participate in these institutions, how we work within them in ways that can be resistant to co-optation, the ways that we can kind of vigilantly work against being brought into accepting the terms of reference that these institutions often set up as natural, right?
Because and that's why I think cross-disciplinary discussions are so important, because like certainly within, say, the Greens, you'll have a lot of like really active Greens volunteers or Greens staffers who spend most of their time socialising with and thinking with other Greens campaigners and staffers. And I'm sure it's the same in academia, where like academics spend a lot of time talking to other academics about how the university works, and it would be the same in media, where like journalists or radio producers or radio hosts, like they're often thinking in not complete silos, but within sort of semi-closed networks. So for us to be, and you and I have both tried to be spread across many different communities and sites of activism and spaces, so that we're not getting too trapped in certain ways of doing things.
I really like that particular reframing of being spread too thin as a kind of vigilant working against co-optation. Yeah, I'm going to use that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that there is something really useful about being able to see patterns, right? And see patterns in the way that power is operating. And I think this is so in the PhD project that I finished earlier this year that you know we spoke a lot about over the last bazillion years that I was working on it, ended up focusing heaps on liberal reform and the kind of the ways that projects of reform end up kind of foreclosing possibilities for more radical transformation. So the ways that this sort of a kind of an incremental or tinkering around the edges approach comes to stand in for the more radical demands that might have been made before that. And so I ended up looking at the ways that liberal reform is kind of a fuel for settler colonial nation building. And that sounds like a kind of abstract or far away point, but I think the way that it has shaped the conversations that we've had about our own complicity and our own participation in institutions like the university or the government is that I think these are, at their core, a lot of the theories of change that these institutions rely on are reformist. That they do tell us a story that if we just change a couple of things, if we just make a few key reforms, that is where justice will come from. In the story of academia, it's a story of, you know, if we can just gather a bit more data, you know, if we can just tell a better story, if we know more, then we will do better. And I think in electoral politics, it's often a story of if there are just better people in politics, then better outcomes will happen. And I suppose that's kind of the place we wanted to like really dig into, you know, to have that messier conversation and a more transparent conversation too, right?
Yeah, like being honest about the limits of electoral politics. And because so one thing that the Greens often present as a narrative or explanation for what's going wrong with the political system is a perhaps somewhat simplistic characterization of political corruption. So we talk about how, some politicians are taking bribes or are doing dodgy deals with mates, or perhaps like the corporate donations, right? That becomes this sort of stand-in for like, there's a more general frustration with politicians not listening to people. And so the sort of simplistic diagnosis is like, political parties take donations from big business and then big business influences decision-making. But I think the truth is perhaps more subtle and complex than that, because it's not just like bad people or corrupt people getting into politics and then serving their own interests. There are often plenty of people who have really good intentions, who are getting into politics for the right reasons, quote unquote, and who one way or another become disciplined by those systems that they're participating in. And that's something that I think, like you would argue, we see in every institutional space, that people are there with good intentions, but they can slowly be co-opted by those spaces.
Absolutely. I laughed because I'm thinking about Mananjali and South Sea Islander Professor Chelsea Bottigo just telling us never, just let's let go of the idea of good intentions.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that there is something useful about also being able to draw these connections, because I think it gives us a clearer sense of where the problem lies. And I think about there's a very simple line from the Black feminist abolitionist scholar Angela Davis, where she says, to be radical is to tackle things from their roots. And she's talking she's giving a speech, and she's talking about the kind of what it means to aim for transformation and to build a kind of abolitionist politics. Is simply to say that it's not enough to respond to the layer of problems up here, right? That there is deeper work to be done, but more significantly that unless we do that deeper work, the things that we do up here are not going to function in the way we think they are, that it's not going to do what we think it's going to do. And actually sometimes that the tinkering up here actually makes this stuff down here worse.
Yeah.
So,
well, and sorry to interrupt, but what you said earlier about the problems or limitations of liberal reform also made me think about how within, say, certain green spaces or other activist and political spaces, sometimes the most harmful thing to do can be to say that we're doing something radical or making a big transformational change when actually it is just incremental reformism. And so I think it's almost more damaging to pretend that, we're making this big, important change that will fundamentally transform, say, housing, for example, when actually it's a fairly minor reform, but we're talking about it as though it's a big thing because that's what voters want to hear or our supporters want to hear. And I think we see all the parties doing that, right? Sorry.
Absolutely. No. And I think it's to very briefly veer into, disciplinary training in political science. I'm very sorry. But it's a problem of liberalism, right? And I think this is a kind of dynamic that we see within the Greens, within political parties more broadly, within the kind of NGO sector, within the universities certainly, which is this kind of maybe in some cases, in the more sort of radical parts of these movements, people might also say that they're not reformists, right? They might be like, no, absolutely, reform's not enough. We do need transformation. And I think the sort of messy part of the equation that we're also interested in this conversation is so how is it then that those of us who are committed, we think we are committed to transformation, to radical change, to abolishing regimes of violence, we still end up, tinkering around the edges, right? And this is, I think, the thing that we wanted to dig into was this idea that complicity and co-optation are not accidents, right? They're not oops, oh no, it's happened. These are built in, these are structural forces, and the status quo is maintained through a regime of co-optation and rendering us complicit, and particularly rendering those of us who might have sought out more transformative possibilities. So I think of reform and reformism as this kind of process, as a kind of disciplining process, which I think is a term you used right at the beginning. One of the ways that these existing systems of power function is that we start out with a real vision of, what we think ought to happen. But the parameters are narrowed by the...
Constantly, right? Yeah.
Exactly, by the constraints of what is possible within an existing system. And I think as long as you are working within the terms of reference of that system, there are hard limits to what is possible, right? And I think that is a kind of complex question for electoral organising.
Yeah, and I think that's where because I want to interrogate, and you and I will have more of these conversations over the course of this 6-month campaign, so we won't be able to drill down into all of it today. But I guess I'm interested in how are those limits set? When we talk about, there are hard limits to how much change we can push for or exactly what we can achieve within a given system. Yeah, to what extent are those hard limits, or are those just sort of self-imposed or collectively imposed limits? How much agency do we have in those spaces? If we're really intentional about it, can we resist complicity and co-option to a greater degree? And I would argue, say, within the Greens in Queensland, for a while there's been an explicit intention of saying, no, we don't want to settle for the parameters of debate that Labor and the Liberal parties are imposing. We're going to call for stuff that's a little bit outside of mainstream political consensus or, shifting the Overton window. And so there has been, to some extent, a willingness to push the boundaries a little bit and talk about stuff that historically might have been seen to be politically unpopular or dangerous. Or so there's a something there, a partial willingness to resist orthodoxy. And I think that has served the Greens quite well in Queensland. And the vote in Queensland has risen faster than in other states. But at the same time, as the party grows, there is still this continual self-censorship or self-checking of like, oh, but we can't go too far because then we'll lose people kind of thing. And I think, we see that in every institutional space, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, even if you think about the kind of terms of reference, like maybe beyond the kind of space of policy making even, like one of the things that I know you and I have talked about is that one of the challenges of electoral politics is that it promises that if you get this one person elected, then everything will change, right? And there are ways that that this is and can be demobilizing for collective organizing, because there is a promise that one person will now fix everything.
Yeah,
Woo-hoo,
yeah.
we
It's
got
like,
someone elected.
vote Greens, and then once we're in balance of power, we'll introduce all this stuff, and then so maybe we have a poorer election result and we don't win, and everyone feels demoralized because their main reason for campaigning was to win. Or we do win, and then some people get elected, and then all those people who helped them get elected are like, great, job done, I can dust off my hands and chill for a while. And so, yeah, you're right. Like even a victory can end up being demobilizing because we've pushed a few individuals into positions of power and influence within the mainstream system, but we haven't necessarily built collective power.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I am just really interested in the things that we do together, and I'm really interested in the possibilities of collective organising and working within communities of struggle. And I think it's also the thing that I think is one of the ways to ward against those projects of rendering us complicit and co-opting us into systems of power. And this is the conversation that you and I were having as we were riding our bikes here this morning, was about how do we think about this kind of process of being made complicit and the ways that we can, I guess, vigilantly work against that. And I think the place that I've come to on that is like, well, we can't. These are ongoing processes, right? We are constantly this power is being enacted on us all the time, and we're participating in it in different ways all the time. But that there is nonetheless still something useful about building the kinds of communities where you can have robust conversations about the choices you're making and see them from the vantage point of people who aren't experiencing power in the precise way you are, right? So, and, you and I talked about this in the period of time where you were working as a city councillor, and, we would come together in the evening and we would talk about the ways that, we were negotiating the decisions of our everyday lives. And I think simply having the spaces where you can talk to people who are experiencing the sort of, disciplinary forces of different institutions in different ways does feel quite useful. And I think one of the things that's tough about the sort of campaign, the campaign common sense, the sort of traditional structure of election campaigns, is that one of the places where I think we're very quick to cede a lot of space to a sort of dominant mythology is around the idea that we have to tell a particular sort of story about what a campaign is and what it's for. And that story does have to be about the value of voting Greens, because then we'll have more Greens MPs. And I think I'm really interested in whether we can find ways to have campaigns that are really about the kinds of communities that we can build through these processes, and the kinds of ways we can build mutuality. We can be responsible to one another. We can be in community in meaningful ways. I'm not sure. That sounds a bit fluffy.
But. No, but it makes me think about how, because there is certainly a campaign orthodoxy, and I think this probably applies to almost every growing political party, of like, we have to be on message and we have to be consistent in what we're telling both our volunteers and supporters, but also the wider public. So there's not much space for public critique. Like, critique could be generative and mutually supporting and that sort of stuff. But often any critique or any departure from orthodoxy is seen as a direct threat or challenge to the entire political project or the campaign. And that's the same with NGOs and other spaces. Like, that's definitely not exclusive to political parties. But yeah, I guess it just makes me think a lot about how we do continually push for that culture of like, where a dozen different possibilities are all considered, valid and worth considering, or like that there's that space for multiplicity of views and messages and ideas within a campaign, so that we don't insist too much on a single narrow orthodoxy. And even out in the wider public, there's this cynicism of politicians towing the party line. And I think that kind of also speaks to what we're getting at here, because there are sort of party lines that people feel pressure to adhere to. And partly that's because there are these democratic or consensus-based processes to arrive at what the party policy is or what the position is. But there's still, like, I think a broader challenge of like, okay, we can all agree that these are our policies or these are our key messages for this coming election period, but we still have to make space for, strategic discussions about how we talk about that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's so many directions I want to take this conversation,
time,
and
right?
I feel like there's a bunch to dig into. But it does, for me, come back to the kind of the importance of creating spaces where we can have the harder conversations and we can have those publicly. And this is something that I think I've been so impressed with with your willingness to keep doing this, because I know it's tough and it takes a toll, but to do this work of consistently setting out showing you're working, setting out the ways you're coming to decisions, the sets of kind of competing ideas and values that are at play in every single decision that you end up making, and the ways that there is something I think really important about I am obviously really interested in political education, understood in its broadest sense as not just kind of education for the purposes of, a job under capitalism, but political education as in developing a shared vocabulary for the way power is functioning in our lives and being able to find ways to better name the sites of power so that we can better intervene in them. And so I think in that sense, there is something really useful about having public political conversations about the limits of electoralism, because I think, hopefully you do get elected. And if you do get elected, then it's kind of on a different term of reference. And I think that's really exciting to me. Like, what does it mean to get elected, not because you've accepted that there was a certain level of compromise necessary to get into that position, but now that you're there, you're going to do things differently. But instead to say, no, we're going to work from a different term of reference. We are going to set up a context in which we're saying, absolutely, electoralism is not enough. And that is not I'm not going to be the answer to injustice by getting elected. But there is work to be done, and this is a vehicle to do some of that work.
Yeah, and I think, as you said, really being honest about the limits is the starting point, right? Rather than telling ourselves a story of this will fix everything, which I think when you talk to any Greens campaigner for more than 5 minutes, they'll be like, yeah, of course this doesn't fix everything.
Absolutely.
Of course, most people who are participating in these systems understand that there are limits and aren't naive about the fact that okay, this is an imperfect system, but it's a pathway to get some positive change or to crack open the opportunities for further possibilities. But
totally. No, and this is what has always struck me is that I am not a particularly engaged Greens volunteer, but I have been involved in campaigns a lot over the years.
Well, you probably won't like me reminding people this, but you were way back in 2010, way before I got involved with the Greens, you were the lead youth organiser for Larissa Waters in the 2010 campaign when the Greens won our first Senate seat in Queensland.
Yes,
so you were the original Greens party hack in my life. And I remember back then, I don't think it was a big part of your political development, but you were really into that space and since then have shifted more into political education and a more diverse range of campaigning and organising, where I've kind of gone deeper into electoral politics in a way. So are you worried you've lost activist cred now?
I was 20, so what I was going to say is that I think that really resonates. And I think one of the reasons I'm so interested in these conversations is because you're absolutely right. Every time I've been involved in a campaign, every person I know who's done political organising has a nuanced, critical take on the relationship between the work they do as electoral organisers and their broader political vision of the future, right? Most people aren't just doing electoral organising. And so what I'm interested in is why that isn't part of the kind of orthodox messaging of campaigns, right? We know that is how a lot of the people who are passionate about election organising, electoral work are also going to, Saturday's Black Deaths in Custody rally. We know they're also showing up to these important sites of community solidarity, right? But the story of political campaigns continues to be a story of how all we need to do is work super hard to get this person elected, and then we'll eventually have enough people elected, and then we will eventually be able to, and so I think it's also about more closely connecting the actual experiences of people who are doing actual political work on the ground and having spaces to really think seriously about those experiences. Like what, and this is the thing I think we've talked about a lot over the years about complicity and co-optation, is that it's also not just about being like, oh, yep, I've been co-opted. It's about strategically engaging with that, being like, I can see the way that power is functioning in this particular way. I can see the way that I'm starting to be compromised, that I'm starting to like understand on the basis of a different term of reference than maybe where I started. So what am I going to do about that? So what does that require of me?
Well said. And I think we're almost out of time now. But we will have to come back to this. I'm looking forward to further discussions with you of where we can dive a little bit deeper into how exactly does the political system discipline individual politicians and staffers and candidates and all that, and how are we collectively resisting those disciplining or acquiesce into them? I think that's really interesting stuff. Was there anything else you wanted to sort of round off today's chat with before we wrap things up, or what's the one question you want to pose to listeners to think about and come back, if there is one, what do you hope people think more deeply about over the next 6 months, particularly people who are participating or following this election campaign? I've put you on the spot now. You're so many things.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, my mind has gone in 17 directions at once.
Could see the neurons fire off in 1,000 directions.
So I think a question that I come back to a lot is kind of linked to a quote from the Palestinian writer Stephen Slater, and it's one of the quotes that kind of shapes the work of the Institute for Collaborative Race Research, which I was lucky enough to be based at for my PhD project. And Stephen Slater says, be loyal to the dispossessed, that is all. That is his invocation for the people reading the piece where he says this. And I think about I guess the question I come back to pretty often is, what does it mean to be in uncompromising solidarity with particularly Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in their sovereignty? What does it mean to be in uncompromising solidarity with people who are experiencing the brutality of the state in all of its forms? And what does it mean if we centre that kind of uncompromising solidarity in everything we do? Well
said. Thanks for that, Anna. And thank you for this great chat. I've really enjoyed this, and I'm looking forward to, thinking more deeply about this stuff over not just the next 6 months, but over whatever happens over the coming years.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me.
Cool. All right, thanks everyone. We'll catch you next time, I guess. See ya.